Hello. I hope people are feeling well on this Wednesday. If you've been following these video updates for the last couple of weeks, you may have noticed that I tend not to focus on President Trump. I want to give the other headlines, the international COVID-19 headlines, because frankly, President Trump takes up a lot of media space, and there's many, many other people talking about the ups and downs and eccentricities of his political style. But this time, President Trump is the international headline. Particularly people around the world were baffled by his decision, shocked by it in some cases, to cut off funding to the World Health Organization in the midst of a pandemic. The Guardian newspaper here in the UK had this headline: Trump turns against the WHO to mask his own stark failings on COVID-19 crisis. And that expressed a lot of the global headlines. The Lancet, a respected medical journal, the editor of the journal told the BBC that it was a crime against humanity to cut off the funding. And many experts point out that the WHO doesn't just provide information for a lot of poorer countries that don't have robust health services. It provides some of those emergency response capabilities. And those experts say without funding, with a diminished ability to operate, that the WHO could fail in its ability to provide some of those needed services to poorer countries if other countries don't step up and fill in the funding gap. But there have been criticisms from world leaders as well, not just in health experts in the media. The Secretary General of the UN said this is not the time to be pointing blame. So did the Foreign Minister of Germany. And the UN chief also said something interesting. He said that this is now globally an international epidemic of misinformation. And if you look online and you follow all the social media, or at least follow social media, you'll notice there are many, many conspiracy theories out there that the coronavirus was created in a laboratory in Wuhan, that it was either weaponized and broke out accidentally, or it was deliberately planted, or that it was some sort of plot to gain world domination. Well, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the most senior U.S. military official, said that partly because of all of this talk, and because it would obviously be something of tremendous significance if it were true, that U.S. intelligence agencies did look into it, and that the overall weight of the evidence that they found suggested that it was not created in a lab, but that it was transmitted naturally. And so scientists have pointed to a wet market as a potential place of origin, that in this wildlife market in Wuhan, there was some sort of transmission from bat to potentially through a secondary animal to humans. But the chairman of the Joint Chiefs said that even though the weight of the evidence suggests this was not created in a lab, he said we still don't know for certain.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.